With that, he takes over. Thank you for coming out on a Tuesday afternoon. And you getting ready to buckle up your seatbelts for the next week? I saw as I was driving down here, you got, was it Fox setting up down at the Bedford Village Inn? And I don't know, it's get ready. But this is going to kind of get you ready, I hope. So how many of you have been to met a candidate? Anybody here hasn't met a candidate yet? Maybe that's a better way to frame it, huh? How many have met more than 2 or 3? I mean, we're all working, that's our job. So how did the primary get to be first? Well, first of all, let me talk a little bit about the history of me and why I'm up here and taking this place, going around being so bold to think I might know more about the primary than other people. So about 30 years ago, a friend of mine in Concord, Charles Brereton, who was the foremost authority on the New Hampshire primary, had written a book that he hadn't yet published. And he called me up and he said, you interested in maybe working together to produce a documentary on the history of the primary? I'll be your researcher, you can use my book as the base and we'll go after it. And so we got involved and we produced this primary history in 1986. Now, that book is right back there on the shelf. It's called The History of the New Hampshire Primary, or what is it called? You got your hand on it right there. First in the nation. Chuck, actually, after I finished the documentary, he took some of the interviews and so on that I did and incorporated them into the book. So the book became a blending of the documentary and his history. But his history was the base for this documentary. The documentary was 2 hours long, and we're just going to look at little clips of it today. And then in 2000, I was approached by the New Hampshire Political Library. Actually, Chuck and I were approached by the New Hampshire Political Library to update it because 4 more primaries had passed since we did it. So we sat down and we took on a part 2 of the documentary, as it was called, covering it up through the year 2000. So there's the basis for my authoritarian nature about the primary. So let's start with, how did the primary come to be? Primary elections actually have their roots in the progressive movement of the early part of the 20th century. The very first state to hold a primary was actually Wisconsin, which was home base to Robert La Follette, who was the national leader of the Progressive Party. And what was the reason? The reason because back in those days, there wasn't a lot of public input into who the candidates would be on a particular ballot. You know, you hear the expression about it was back rooms. Back rooms is where all this was done. So primary elections, the idea of a primary election came out of the idea of making this not a backroom deal, but getting the public, getting the voters involved. And by 1912, 12 states were holding primaries. Now, as I said, they had the roots in the progressive movement. The progressive movement in New Hampshire really had its 2 primary leaders in the progressive movement in New Hampshire were Robert Bass from over in Peterborough and Winston Churchill. Now, do you all know who I'm talking about when I talk about Winston Churchill? It wasn't Winston Churchill who was over in Great Britain. It was Winston Churchill of Cornish, New Hampshire, who at the time was probably one of the best known and well-known writers in America. Second to Mark Twain, but nevertheless well known. And in fact, Winston Churchill in England at one point was getting his fan mail. And Winston Churchill in England, when he wrote his first book, New Hampshire's Winston Churchill's publisher approached him and said, hey, why don't you 2 guys do a joint book tour? The 2 Winston Churchills selling their books together. And the New Hampshire guy says, I really don't want to be associated with some loser guy over in England. Now, the sad part about our Winston Churchill was that he died in 1947, which meant he lived long enough to see his fame eclipsed by that know-nothing guy over in England. I ran into one of the talk I gave the other day, Steve Taylor, our former agricultural commissioner, was at. And Steve actually remembers Winston Churchill because he grew up in the town where Churchill was living. And he told me that, and I've heard this story from before, Churchill used to walk around with a counter, walk around like this, and he would click. And finally Steve said, one day I asked him what it was all about. He said he was counting his thoughts. Take that into consideration. At any rate, Churchill ran for governor of New Hampshire and didn't make it. Bass did make it, was elected to the governorship in 1910. And unfortunately, he was not able to persuade the legislature to create a presidential primary for New Hampshire. They did create a state primary for state offices, but the legislature wasn't ready to create a presidential primary. In 1912, Theodore Roosevelt decided he was going to make another shot at the presidency, and he started the Bull Moose Party. And the Bull Moose Party really ruptured the Republican Party nationally and here in New Hampshire, which opened doors for the Democratic Party. So in 1912, the Democratic Party won the governorship. Samuel Belcher was our governor, and both houses of the legislature. And one of the first things they did was they created a presidential primary for us here in New Hampshire, to be held the third Tuesday in May. There was a logic behind that. The logic was, well, if we get in at the end, it'll be down to one or two candidates and we can be the one that crowns the king. But before that next primary came, or before that first primary came around, other people started saying, yeah, but then we have to have two elections, and you know, we're pretty cheap up here in New Hampshire. So they decided to, rather than have it on the third Tuesday in May, to have it on town meeting day. One election, one day, save some money, let's do it. So in 1916, New Hampshire held its first presidential primary. Now, I'd like to ask, how many birthdays does the New Hampshire primary have? How many who wants to take a guess? You can just hold up your fingers. 5, 10, 15? All right, you got a 3 over here. Anybody else want to try?
It'd be the 100th.
Well, I'm talking about what you would celebrate on the 100th, okay? So, birthday number 1 is when the primary was created in 1913. Birthday number 2 is the fact that we had that very first primary in 1916. Now, 1916, Indiana had a primary too, and their primary was a week before ours. And Minnesota had a primary, and their primary was on the same day as ours, so we weren't first. But in the intervening next 4 years, Indiana decided to move its primary to May, and Minnesota decided to move to a caucus system. And that was how we became first in the nation. 1920, we were the first in the nation to hold a presidential primary. And we have here a ballot from that race. Notice the difference. Things different. What's the first thing that strikes you? Come on, y'all got to see it. Yeah, but what about the Republican? It's a blue ballot. The Republicans were blue and the Democrats were a faded pink.
I thought it was somebody other than Gardner was Secretary of State.
No, well, yeah, that's true. How did that happen, huh? So here's the deal. See if I can. I want to show you, because one of the things I like to do when I talk is let's make some connections here, connections, because there are threads that run all the way through here. So we don't hear about Warren G. Harding or Calvin Coolidge or Franklin D. Roosevelt ever coming to New Hampshire to campaign. Well, here's the ballot for the primary, and that explains the reason why, if you can figure out. There are no presidential candidates' names on the ballot. You didn't vote for a presidential candidate. You voted for a delegate to the convention. Now, small state New Hampshire, everybody knew who everybody was. And now do you see if you can recognize any of these names here. Charles Tobey. Anybody know who Charles Tobey is? Charles Tobey went on to be governor of New Hampshire and also a United States Senator and was also a congressman. He's the only other historical figure in the 20th century other than Judd Gregg that held all 3 positions. Charles Tobey. But you can see now some of these candidates, it says pledge to vote for the nomination of Leonard Wood. There's several of them in here that are pledged to vote for Leonard Wood. I just got this yesterday from the State Archives, and I actually had to look up, Mr. Historian here, I had to look up who the heck is Leonard Wood. Well, Leonard Wood was a candidate for president. He was a Rough Rider, one of Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders. And when Theodore Roosevelt died before the 1920 election, they decided to push another Rough Rider in to take Theodore Roosevelt's place. So that explains another name down here, and see if you recognize it, Frank Knox. Anybody recognize the name Frank Knox? We got one. Frank Knox was also a Rough Rider, friend of Theodore Roosevelt's. He came to New Hampshire in 1912 and started a newspaper called the Manchester Evening Leader. And that paper was started with one purpose, to push the Bull Moose Party and elect Theodore Roosevelt president. So here he is, he's still here. Frank Knox went on to be the vice presidential nominee along with Alf Landon in, what would that be, 1928? And Frank Knox owned the union leader until 1947. Talked about him later. And the last one I'll point out is John Winant. How many recognize the name John Winant? It's funny that more people recognize his name. And up in Concord, I hope everybody would know it because we've just got the new statue to John Winant. John Winant also served 3 terms as governor of New Hampshire as a Republican. He was selected by Franklin Roosevelt to be the very first director of the Social Security Administration. It was kind of Roosevelt's little token to the Republicans. See, I've got some Republicans here helping me out. But most importantly, John Winant went on to be the United States ambassador to Great Britain during World War II, and is probably in Great Britain the most celebrated American. The sad story about John Winant is that he finished that and came back to Concord, and in 1947 he wrote a book. And when his book came into the railroad station, the story goes, I mean, some of this is absolutely true. They said, hey, your ambassador, your book is in. The first shipment of your books has come into the train station. He went upstairs to his bedroom and shot himself. And that was the end of John Winant. And therefore, because of that, John Winant always had this kind of unsteady history. Some people want to really look into John Winant, and others, well, you know what he did. We need to just be quiet about that. But anyway, that's the story of John Winant. But back to the primary. So by 1948, people started saying, why are we having this exercise? We're not voting for candidates, we're just voting for the delegates. So some papers and newspapers around started writing editorials about what is this exercise that's kind of useless. And so some people started to think about it and do something about it. And that's where we're going to meet our first person, and we're going to talk to our first clip, and let's see if I can make this all work, because I'm not used to doing this. Yeah, here we go. This man here, anybody recognize him? Wouldn't expect you to. He was an attorney in Concord, New Hampshire. His name is Richard Upton. If you go up to Concord, his law firm is still there, and where I did this interview is still there. It's right across from the State Library, and now it's Upton and Hatfield today. He was what was called a comer, a young guy. He came from a political family. His father was a well-known attorney in the state, and he was elected to the state legislature, and at a very young age, he became Speaker of the House. And he was the one that said, I think I'm going to do something about this primary. So we're going to take this clip now. I'm going to back up my little scroll and let Richard tell his story.
So in the 1949 legislature, when I was elected Speaker, fortunately, I saw to it that a bill was introduced. I didn't at that time feel that the Speaker should introduce a bill under his own name. So I had a friend of mine, Reuben Moore of Bedford, sponsor the bills. He agreed with me about it. And I wrote the bills out on one weekend, some of them on the back of an envelope.
Richard Upton's bill did essentially 2 things. First, it put the names of presidential candidates on the ballot in a preference poll or beauty contest. Secondly, it allowed for the inclusion of a candidate's name on the ballot by petition with 100 signatures, unless a candidate specifically asked not to be on the ballot.
I guess the idea is to force the presidential candidates into the field, whether they want to or not.
The bill passed both houses of the legislature with voice votes and full support of both Democratic and Republican leadership. On May 11th, 1949, Governor Sherman Adams signed the bill creating the New Hampshire presidential preference primary.
He wasn't too sure that he ought to sign it. I went in, he called me in and said, what does this bill mean? And we went over the possible consequences. I think we discussed how it might impact on various upcoming candidates. I gave it as my opinion that it would quicken the interest of the voters, that there would be a real, I hoped, a real lively contest, and that our state would be put on the map.
So you have to appreciate people like Richard Upton. First of all, the understatement. Hoped that it might put our state on the map. But more importantly, I did this interview in 1986, To my knowledge, it was the first time Richard Upton ever sat down and talked to somebody about his role in creating the presidential primary. Very humble guy. So, 1952, that's the fourth birthday of the New Hampshire primary. 1920 being the third, and we're about to celebrate that 100th. And 1952 is when the primary was created as we know it today, with some differences. The first difference is this idea of a beauty contest. Because in fact, that's all it was. There was absolutely zero connection between how many votes a candidate got and how many delegates he would take to the convention. It was still that old time you had to vote separately for the delegates. And you had to know that Sherman Adams was a delegate for Dwight Eisenhower, or that Richard Upton was a delegate for Dwight Eisenhower, or that Stiles Bridges was a delegate for Robert Taft. They were completely disconnected. Now, the other aspect to it, and we're going to talk about in a minute, let's look at the lay of the land on the Republican side in 1952. What was the most important thing to the Republicans in 1952? Anybody want to take a guess at that? I'm challenging your history here, I know, but that's my job. That's my job. I got to engage you folks, you know. 1952, sure.
Coming in from the wilderness after 4 terms of Roosevelt.
Well, some people now have called it the wilderness, but yes, you're close. You're right on it. And it actually wasn't 4 terms of Roosevelt, it was 5 terms of Democratic White House, in the White House. So it was really important for them to win. And in 1952, probably the most celebrated hero in the world was a man named Dwight Eisenhower. Okay? And we all know why Dwight Eisenhower was the head of Allied forces in World War II. But he was also, politics were down here, and Dwight Eisenhower was up here, and he was never going to lower himself to be in politics. People didn't even know what party he would be a part of. And finally in 1950, and so both parties were kind of coveting him, trying to convince him, well, will you come out for us? You know, we want you to be our candidate. And finally, Henry Cabot Lodge in 1951 went over to NATO, and at that time Eisenhower was the commander of the NATO forces in Europe, and got Eisenhower to say or admit that he was in fact a Republican. And Lodge came back to New York and held a press conference that Dwight Eisenhower's a Republican. Dwight Eisenhower's a Republican. Still, Eisenhower wasn't going to come out and say, I'd like to run for president. So if you remember Upton saying he and Adams talked a little bit about how this might impact on the candidates in the next election. Remember, both of them are Republicans. Eisenhower didn't need to go into the Secretary of State's office and say, I want to run for president. Sherman Adams could do that, or Richard, anybody could go in and put a candidate's name on the ballot. Anybody could do that. And if the candidate didn't, the only action a candidate might take was if he didn't want his name on the ballot, he could ask to have it taken off. But he didn't have to ask to have it put on. People could do that for him. So Dwight Eisenhower, even asking to have his name taken off the ballot, was a little bit below him. So it worked out perfectly. He could maintain his distance, he could maintain his heroship, and all these people over in New Hampshire could play the game to see if he could actually win an election. And that's what happened. The Republicans really had 2 primary candidates in 1952 on the Republican side. Dwight Eisenhower, who never came to the state, obviously. And then you had Robert Taft, who was from the United States Senator, the son of William Howard Taft, a president back in 1912 when the first primary was held. Or, I'm sorry, no, before the first primary was held. And Taft was the more conservative. Taft was on the conservative side. Eisenhower was a more moderate Republican. And what would happen is they would have little meetings, and there would be the people who would come in and pretend that they would speak for Dwight Eisenhower, and then there'd be somebody speaking for Taft, to have these debates, not between the candidates, but for surrogates for the candidates. And then about a week before the primary, the weekend before the primary, Taft decided to do something that Eisenhower wouldn't, and that was he made a campaign trip up to New Hampshire. Really, in many ways, it was, on the Republican side, the first campaign trip of a presidential candidate. He went all the way up to northern Colebrook, came down, did a big circle around the state. But here was the problem. Dwight Eisenhower saw himself above politics. Robert Taft saw himself above campaigning. to a bunch of hicks up in New Hampshire. And he lost more votes than he gained. There's a classic picture, actually it's in the book that Chuck did back there, of Taft. Actually, it's on the back cover. Could you just, the one that says First in the Nation? On the back cover, is there a picture of Robert Taft holding a chicken? There he is. You can pass it around. Holding a chicken, you can just see the disgust in his face. What am I doing holding a chicken? I'm the most important Republican in the country, and I'm running for president, and these people give me a chicken to hold? I mean, he didn't work. It didn't work. At any rate, that's the Republican side. Pardon?
Did he get the chickens vote?
He didn't even get the chicken owners vote. But that's the the Republican side. And what I'm really going to focus on now is the Democratic side. So let's look at that Democratic side. We had Harry Truman, who still hadn't said he was or was not going to run for office in 1952. Speculation was he might not, but who knew for sure? Only Harry Truman. So there was this senator from out in Tennessee named Estes Kefauver. Anybody heard the name Estes Kefauver before? All right, we got some good people here, because Estes Kefauver, after Richard Upton, is probably the most important person in the history of the presidential primary. Kefauver was chairman of the Senate subcommittee investigating organized crime in the United States. That committee actually was portrayed in The Godfather 2. And that committee, more than just investigating organized crime, television was new in the arena here, and it was being broadcast live. It was the first Senate investigative committees broadcast live to the country. And everybody was tuning in to watch this. And people that didn't have TVs would go to movie theaters and watch it on the movie theaters. So in many ways, Estes became the first political television star in our country. And he thought, maybe I'd like to run for president. And he thought, maybe what I'll do is I'll just stick my toe out there and show that I can get votes, and people, when Truman says he's not going to run, they'll look at me because I've already demonstrated I can get votes. So he decided to come up to New Hampshire and get himself involved, and just not to win, but just to have a good, moderate showing. So therefore, there's the story, and now we're going to pick it up and let the people involved tell it. Can you hear it all right?
I couldn't find any Democrats. And there was a little general store there, and the man kicked me out of the store when he heard that I was a Democrat. He said, we don't have any Democrats, and we don't allow them to stay here very long. Get.
In 1952, New Hampshire Democrats were at best fragmented, at worst a token opposition party that some believed was even run by Republicans. They hadn't held a major statewide office in over 15 years, but the primary would open state Democrats to a new world of politics. And it would be a Democratic candidate who sparked the style of campaigning that has become the mark of the New Hampshire primary.
All right, I'm going to pause. I haven't done this before. So here's the committee for the committee. This guy here is William Hawley. He was the chief counsel for the committee. This is Estes Kefauver. But this guy right here, anybody know who he is? Charles Tobey. Remember, his name was on the ballot? He at this time was a senator, and he was the ranking Republican senator on this committee. All right, sorry, just had to break a little bit. Break the momentum. But
AFA. He thanked me, that was about all. How long were you there? Not more than 10 minutes.
As chairman of the Senate Special Committee to investigate interstate crime, Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver became the nation's first political television star. The investigation marked the first live national television coverage of a congressional hearing. Americans from California to New Hampshire were tuning in. Believing that Harry Truman would not seek another term in office, Kefauver wanted to establish himself as a viable Democratic candidate for president, and he looked to the New Hampshire primary as the vehicle to do it.
Well, I was sitting quietly in the office one day and mind my own business, and a very strong conservative in Laconia called me up and said, Tom, he said, you know Estes Kefauver's coming up here to the tavern to campaign next Sunday? I said, no. Well, he says, I think it's your duty as former Democratic mayor to get down and meet him. So I said, well, all right, maybe I should. So Merton and I went down.
Kefauver was the first Democratic senator that many in New Hampshire had ever seen. He was an anomaly, a Democrat who thought himself a winner. Though many owed their loyalties to the president, Kefauver quickly gained supporters, especially among women, many of whom had seen him on television during his committee hearings.
We all stood around the little knot. Hugh Bounds was there, Bernie Booton was there, I was there, and so was Myrtle. And what happened was that he said, "Well, now, Tom, you're going to help me be my chairman." I said, "I can't be your chairman. I'm the county chairman." He looked around at Huey Bounds and says, "Hugh, you're going to help me?" I said, "Hugh, you can't help him. You're the city chairman." By that time, all of a sudden, there was this little voice from the back of the group. It says, "Senator, I'll help you." It was Mrs. Mack. He said, "Madam Chairman."
He got this little boy hurt look on his face. Everybody was turning him down. And I thought, gee, this man comes, he's a senator, nobody will help him, they're crazy. I said, "Senator, I'll help you." It was just on an impulse. Because the fact was, I was a registered Republican.
Gfroerer brought a new style of campaigning to New Hampshire. It was personal, sometimes gimmicky, but voters liked it, and it made good copy for the national press covering the primary.
You know, he'd just go up the street with his big hand, and he was a big man. And, you know, just very casually, "Well, my name's Estes Gfroerer, I'd like your help," and move right on. They had a system that was, the Washington staff behind him was a gal getting your name, and then went a letter. We'd never seen anything like this.
And Estes would put on any kind of a hat. I'm not sure that was the best thing in the world, but he would. And he got into everything there was. If we had a toboggan, he would ride in the toboggan. If there was an ice skater or something, he'd try to skate with him. And every kind of a gadget. We found an old fire truck, I think it was, down in Hooksett. And that was all rigged up with lights. And we run it up and down the street in Manchester at night, and Estes was along there, tailing along with him, shaking hands with everybody that he could find.
Once he started it, everyone had to do it. And the people expected to be courted in that way. In the old times, if you wanted to carry a community, you went to see 5 or 6 or 4 or 5 of the leaders, and sometimes fewer number, and if you could sell yourself to them, they would get out the vote in the town for you. But that isn't true anymore.
So when it comes to personal campaigning, going out and shaking hands, going into people's homes, riding dogs, it's Estes Gfroerer that set that in motion. And that continues to this day. You can trace the roots of this primary, the way candidates interact with us here in New Hampshire, right back to Estes Gfroerer. Little tweaks along the way, and we'll talk about some of those tweaks, but it all started here. Now, a little production note, actually. When we did the interview with the McIntyres, people remember Tom McIntyre, senator for 16 years, great guy. I was only going to interview Tom McIntyre. And while we're sitting up, Myrtle was kind of pacing around, you know, and you just sense that she wanted, you know. And so finally I said, "Well, would you like to sit down with us?" Just kind of trying to be polite. Boom, she was there. And she really made the interview. The dynamic between the two of them was as interesting as listening to them say. And another thing, as I reminded of recently, when McIntyre died about 25 years ago, I thought that I would transcribe this interview and send it out to newspapers to play, and maybe 3 or 4 newspapers did. But I had to shorten it down, really. But as I was listening to it, I didn't watch it, I just listened to it and was typing. There came a point where McIntyre started telling a story about Lyndon Johnson. And you could sense, oh, we're going to get a good story here. And all of a sudden he stops and he says, "Is that thing still running?" He knew he was pointing at the TV camera. And you hear all this, "Oh, no, it's all right, we'll shut it off. And everything went silent. I don't know what the story is. Lost that story forever. At any rate, so what happened in 1952? Harry Truman never came to New Hampshire to campaign, and Estes Gfroerer won the primary. Big embarrassment for the President of the United States to lose to Estes Gfroerer up in New Hampshire. Who are these people up in New Hampshire giving the slap in the face to our president? So we started a tradition up here in New Hampshire of us giving slaps in the faces to the people who were the front runners. And as a result of that, Estes really became a pariah in the Democratic Party. They denied him even the vice presidential spot. Adlai Stevenson was the ultimate nominee to run when Truman, because 2 weeks after the primary, Truman made it official that he was not going to run. Now, was he not going to run anyways? We will never know. But let's talk a bit about this moment in time, because it's so crucial to why the New Hampshire primary is what it became. 1952, you have something new happening out here. You have television and travel, and reporters that were covering Congress or the White House down in DC could get on a plane and fly to New Hampshire in an hour and a half. We became accessible. It's not that we became, we were accessible to a national political press. We were also really picturesque. I mean, we're a beautiful state. They could come up here and kind of relax and discover that we really did have toilets in our houses, you know. But there was this idea of this picture. We were the perfect vision of what democracy should be about, you know. This was 1776 all over again, you know. The people making and deciding who was going to be president. And this is at the peak of the Cold War. So that we became a great advertisement to the world, to anybody, to all the people in China, all the people in Russia, you know. This is why America is so great, because up here in New Hampshire, the farmers are sitting around in their their country store playing checkers next to the potbelly stove and talking about, and not only talking about, but they're going to be deciding who is the leader of the free world. We became a great advertisement for America. And this next piece I'm going to show you is a universal newsreel that shows about the 1952 New Hampshire primary. And listen to that theme in this little clip.
Primary elections in New Hampshire for delegates to the Democratic and Republican national conventions find candidates and campaign managers pulling no punches. Everyone is in there pitching in an endeavor to gauge the mood of the American people. This is the first real popularity test for the favorites, and Senator Robert A. Taft comes to New Hampshire to make his bid. Harold E. Stassen hopes for another opportunity to corral the Republican nomination. The citizens of the Granite State are not easily won. The country meeting places are hotbeds of political discussion. In village, town, and city, voters brave bitter snow and sleet to cast their votes. Eisenhower, Taft, Stassen, Warren, MacArthur, Truman, Gfroerer. It's a free country, and no armed guards to restrict your personal opinion. It was the nation's first presidential primary, and a record one. And when the ballots were totted up, it was a clean sweep for General Eisenhower on the Republican side, and for Senator Estes Gfroerer heading the Democratic slate. Hampshire has spoken, and experts are looking for more straws in the political wind.
So when people ask, why are we first? There's the roots of it right there. We were what America needed at that moment. And we didn't just do it, it just kind of happened, you know? Nobody said, hey, let's make the first presidential. It was done back in 1920 by accident, thanks to Indiana deciding not to be first anymore. And then in 1952, it just took on this new dynamic when we added candidates' names to it. And everybody just seized on the moment. The cover of Newsweek, 2 months before the primary, showed a farmer up in Lebanon. And it was all about how these farmers in New Hampshire are going to decide who's going to be the next president of the United States. That's what we were. Any questions? Oh, come on. I love questions, but it's all right. We'll move on. We'll move on.
When did we make it a law to become first?
Oh, that's ahead. We'll get that's a good question, but don't get me ahead here. I might forget what I'm supposed to say along the way. I'll probably do that anyways. At any rate, so let's look for a minute here about changing dynamics that happen now because of the primary, particularly within the Democratic Party. Because you heard in the reference in that section about the primary that the Democrats really hadn't held elective office in a long time. It wasn't really that long. It felt longer when I was producing this, but at any rate, there was one key person there, and his name was Styles Bridges. You all know who Styles Bridges was? United States Senator from New Hampshire, elected to the Senate in 1934, died in 1961. And in Styles Bridges' lifetime in the Senate, 25 years, no Democrat was elected to any statewide office. That was how tightly controlled the Republican Party was on this state, and how Styles Bridges was key to that. So you had these Democrats that didn't really see themselves as players, and it references here that they hadn't even seen a Democratic senator before. And Estes comes in and inspires them. And now they're starting to think, well, maybe we could do a little, maybe we could be a little stronger party. Tom McIntyre ran for Congress in 1954. Didn't win, but he was, they're starting to feel, okay, maybe we're a little stronger. Well, then in 1956, guy named Bernie Booton, referenced here. Anybody remember the name of Bernie Booton? We're going to meet him. Bernie Booton was a Democrat and Estes Kefauver supporter at the 1956 convention. The Kennedy clan, John F. Kennedy's people, tried to get him to vote for Kennedy to be the vice presidential nominee, and Bernie had a little more integrity and said, nope, I've got to support Estes. But Kennedy liked him and invited him down to Washington later in that year, and Bernie went down to spend a half an hour one-on-one with John F. Kennedy, and as he put it, I would follow him anywhere. So Bernie became Kennedy's man in New Hampshire. And Kennedy, looking at the primary and saying, well, you're first out of the gate, yeah, I'm in New Hampshire, I'm kind of an unknown. He wanted to do well in New Hampshire, and he saw the key for him doing well in New Hampshire was to build the Democratic Party of New Hampshire. And Bernie was key to that. In 1958, Bernie ran for governor of New Hampshire, which made him titular head of the Democratic Party. John F. Kennedy came up here and made TV commercials for Bernie. Obviously, Bernie didn't win governorship, but when Kennedy was elected president, Bernie went to Washington with him, and he was the director of the General Services Administration, which meant that on November 23rd, 1963, Bernie's job was to clean out the Oval Office and move in the new president. So we had this change. The Democrats' party in New Hampshire, thanks to John F. Kennedy and Estes Kefauver, started to get stronger and stronger. And then in 1961, Styles Bridges died and created this void, this vacuum in the Republican Party. And the result was that in 1962, Democrats got elected to the governorship for the first time in over 25 years, and Tom McIntyre got elected to the Senate, first Democrat in the Senate in over 25 years, and the Democratic Party became, not quite, but almost an equal in New Hampshire politics. So I've moved along pretty quick. 1960, we're not going to spend a lot of time on 60. 64, we're going to skip over 1964, and we're going to move to 1968. Now, y'all are going to be able to tell me the answer to this, except for me, the young guy over here who's learning a lot here. 1968, what was the key issue in America in 1968? Oh my God, I love it. Everybody, every time I ask that question, whenever I talk, everybody comes back to the same answer. So the key question was Vietnam, absolutely. And was Johnson doing the right thing? And it created a fracture within the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party wanted to field a candidate to kind of make a statement. And they approached several different people, ultimately settling on Gene McCarthy. And actually, I shouldn't say settling on. Gene McCarthy was the one that finally said, all right, I'll do this. And so November of 1967, Gene McCarthy decided that he would run in the Democratic primary to provide a challenge and make a statement to Lyndon Johnson. So that's this next section here, is the story of that primary, not the whole story, but tidbits of it. And you'll hear Bernie Booton in here. You'll get to see Bernie Booton, who I just talked about. Bernie was a Johnson supporter, obviously, and Bernie, it was his idea, as you say in here, to have all the delegations support Johnson as president. Even that was a controversial thing to do. But here we go, 1968.
You almost knew it was futile, but the statement had to be made about the war.
And for many, many people, it was not the man who wants to be president, but an issue that people were increasingly concerned about. And he's the one who brought it before us.
And there were some of the votes were people who felt that the war hadn't been pursued strongly enough or successfully enough, so it was anti-Johnson in that respect. Not exactly peace people, but who felt that the war was a failure. And there were some who thought he was Joe McCarthy.
In '68, it was very evident to me that one of the things we needed was to revitalize the party. You could see the ragged edges all over the place.
10 years earlier, Bernie Booton had led a new generation of Democrats to control of the state party. Now another generation was about to challenge the status quo and the presidential administration that had brought Democrats to power in the state.
So it really was my suggestion to have Senator McIntyre and Governor King as co-chairman of the campaign. They're good friends to begin with. They're our top office holders in New Hampshire. And hopefully this would provide a unifying base. So instead of two teams, maybe there'd be one team.
First of all, we were told that we were committing treason by the senator, our Democratic senator, and the governor, Democratic governor at the
And
time.
people in the state committee.
In the state committee, that it was, I mean, to the point of treason, and that we would have no political futures whatsoever. And if we had any political ambitions, forget about it. We were committing political suicide.
There was a difference between Washington and New Hampshire. And yet if John King said something, you had to stick by what he said. And that's what got you in trouble, whether you admit it or not.
He accused McCarthy of lack of patriotism. And when they asked me this, I was told I didn't know what the King had said. But I remember saying, oh, I don't think that's fair. I don't think that regardless of McCarthy and what he's saying, that he isn't still a patriot in every sense of the word. And that got us in trouble immediately, because the next morning I was down in Hampton somewhere, or down Hampton Beach or something. And we got a call from the gang saying, hey, King's up in arms, you contradicted him. And I think that's where I kind of mushed out a little bit. I tried to squeal off it. And it was a very difficult thing to get involved in the last stages of that campaign as far as knocking McCarthy around. It wasn't working.
In fact, McCarthy had no competition, for Lyndon Johnson's name wasn't on the ballot. His was a write-in campaign. But both sides were aggressively out to win. Johnson people blanketed the state with numbered pledge cards for people to sign, while the McCarthy people used radio advertising, movie stars, and busloads of out-of-state college students.
Remember Keep Clean with Jean?
Yes, yeah.
We were a little nervous about the kids the hair was too long or a little too rough looking. So they were put in cellars on telephones.
They were marvelous.
Writing envelopes and postcards and doing that kind of thing. There was a screening process. They weren't allowed to go out and knock on doors unless they were reasonably shaved and haircut and sniffed up a little.
Whatever they did, they all worked so hard. And I think the thing they were so valuable for was the door-to-door campaigning that they did. They went into every possible neighborhood that they could. Really.
By 1968, personal campaigning in New Hampshire was no longer a novelty. It was expected. While Johnson ignored the state, McCarthy made sure the voters of New Hampshire had a chance to meet him.
He was more articulate and intelligent than many a politician that I've ever seen, and that appealed to some of us. To others, that was a turnoff. However, he's a very, very gracious, friendly man, and I think anybody that he met personally was charmed by him. And don't you?
Oh, yeah.
I think that, and the fact that he bothered, as I said earlier, to go into funny little places to meet people.
Lyndon Johnson was the actual winner, receiving 49% of the vote. However, McCarthy, who was only supposed to get 10%, ended up with 41% and a decisive moral victory.
So, for the second time in the primary's history, which was short at that point from 1952, we gave a slap in the face to the president. 1952, Harry Truman. 1968, Lyndon Johnson. That's when people started for the first time to say, wait a minute, who are these people in New Hampshire? And what right do they have to kick the president around? What right do they have to be voting first and setting this agenda? So when we look at challenges to the New Hampshire primary, this was the primary that we'd been around for, at that point, this would be the 4th New Hampshire primary where candidates' names are on the ballot. And people, you know, pretty much, it was just, okay, yeah, that's fine. But 1968 was the first year that said, maybe it's not so fine. Now, really, McCarthy was doing the same thing as Estes Kefauver, except just he took it a few steps further. He started bringing in movie stars. That was something new. Bringing in college students. That was something new. So it's taking the base and just tweaking it, expanding it, and moving it along. Now, did you notice in the last headline, right on the corner here, it said, Johnson only gets 4 delegates. That was because in 1968, it was still just a beauty contest. It was a separate vote for the delegates and a separate vote for the candidates, and there was zero connection between the two. And the McCarthy people played it really smart, and they got all the delegates to the convention in 1968. So Johnson won the primary, but McCarthy got the delegates. Still, so now we're going to move on to 1972. Won't ask you what the big issue was. Actually, Vietnam was still kind of an issue in 72. Richard Nixon was a little bit of an issue. But who were the two there were several candidates. And in 1972 is really when you start to have multiple candidates coming into the state. But the two lead candidates were a guy named Ed Muskie from over in Maine and George McGovern from here from South Dakota. Quick question. Who won?
Primary?
Who won the primary in 72? George McGovern or Ed Muskie?
I'll bet on McGovern because Muskie got the nomination.
Okay, well, no, Muskie didn't get the nomination. McGovern did. So how many people, we'll just do it by hand, how many people think McGovern got it, won the primary? And how many think Muskie won the primary? All right, we'll hang on to that. So the thing I want to also say about this next clip, because what was the most famous incident in that campaign having to do with Ed Muskie? You even remember the flatbed truck, good for you. Crying, Muskie cried. Muskie cried, maybe he cried, we'll never really know. So this is the story of how that happened. But more importantly, there's a shift that happens here because there's the campaign that people think is going on, and then there's the campaign that's really going on. And this section here perfectly makes that transition from the campaign that's we think is going on to the camp of what really makes a candidate. And if there was a lesson plan in how to run a campaign in New Hampshire, this would be lesson 101.
The union leader, whether you agreed with us, you hated us, we were a conscience of the state. We still were there to say, aha, this guy is a thief, this guy is stealing, take a look at this, take a look at that. You know, there aren't a lot of newspapers that have the guts to go out and crusade.
The Manchester Union Leader is New Hampshire's largest and only statewide daily newspaper, a potent force in itself. But it was made all the more powerful by its outspoken conservative publisher, William Loeb.
Bill Loeb loved politics. He loved politics as the game of politics. He grew up with politics. He loved the give and take. He loved the power of politics.
They provided a lot of the anti-Muskie ammunition, no question about it. No question about it. They just hammered at it every day, every day.
Politically, we're at the other end of the spectrum, and because we were out of what was the liberal mainstream. But that didn't mean that we were bad. It didn't mean that we were evil. It didn't mean that we did one thing different than any other newspaper, any television channel. We were just looking at it from a different side of the spectrum. We were looking at it from the right. Everyone else was looking at it from the left.
In those days, it was very bad to be a hippie. They would go and photograph hippies in front of the Muskie campaign. You know, well, I don't know whether it was put up or not. You know, you don't know. But they really did everything they could.
I never wrote a word that wasn't true. I never misquoted anyone.
Loeb doesn't like Muskie, and Loeb has been told that Muskie has a short fuse. And Loeb is going to see if he can light this fuse.
Anti-Muskie editorials in the Union Leader were routine. But in February 1972, the Union Leader printed a letter suggesting that Muskie had used the term Canuck to refer to people of French-Canadian heritage.
In Loeb's defense, Loeb ran every letter he got, unless it was clearly libelous. And Loeb got a lot of political letters in any subject. And I think part of Loeb's mindset was, wow, this is great. This is great stuff to get Muskie with.
When issues approached, we rode up San Juan Hill. We didn't just sit around and do nothing about it. And one of his favorite comments would always be, we can be anything, but I'll be damned if we're going to be dull.
The letter was followed the next day by an editorial page reprint of an article from Newsweek magazine in which Muskie's wife Jane revealed a more laid-back personality. Ed Muskie's fuse had been lit. On a snowy Saturday morning, 10 days before the primary, he held a rally in front of the Union Leader office.
By attacking me, by attacking my wife, he has proved himself to be a gutless coward.
I think he lost it. I don't know whether he actually cried, but he obviously got overcome with emotion. Now, why didn't he go to Newsweek in New York and pull his flatbed truck up and have Osborne Elliott come down? You gutless coward, stop picking on my wife. That wasn't going to get him any votes in New Hampshire. He thought he was going to do something to spark his campaign. Instead, it blew up in his face. I called William over and said, what do you think of this guy? He says, geez, a guy like that gets emotional over a little old newspaper publisher? I don't want a guy like that with his finger on the nuclear button.
Oh yeah, every time it comes up to this day, when people hear that I worked on the Muskie campaign, the first thing they say is, oh, too bad he cried. He was a good man, too bad he cried. I've had this, I mean, you know, I had that just the other day, somebody said that. People still say that. But it really wasn't why I lost.
Your campaign, from an organizer's point of view, can be perfection, but it doesn't move unless the candidate transmits a jolt of electricity to it.
Because then people would come during the campaign, I can't tell you how many times, oh, he's not like he was on the TV. And they were comparing the thrill they got, you know, from seeing him on the tube cutting Nixon down to size and remembering how excited and thrilled they were. And it didn't measure up. You know, they were disappointed.
He went to shake hands at the polls. And he went up to this one young woman standing, I think it was Ward 6 in Manchester, as I remember. And he said, my name is George McGovern. And she said, this is the 6th time I've met you.
His wife wouldn't let us schedule him as much as we wanted to. Jane Muskie took care of him. She took care of that man. He had to have a nap, you know, in the middle of the afternoon, and you know, the other candidates were going 24 hours a day, but Ed was having his rest.
The New Hampshire primary demonstrated a new phenomenon in 1968. By being an election, a candidate could win by perception rather than actual votes. Perception would also play a role in 1972. Simply receiving the most votes would not be enough for Ed Muskie to be declared the winner.
What Muskie was running against was not an arbitrary percentage, but an expectation that as the front runner from a neighboring state, he would do very well here. And if Muskie had run a good campaign here and had fallen a few percentage points short of 50%, I don't think anything much would have been made of it.
Ed Muskie won New Hampshire. The fact that he got less than 50%, that perception, they should have never allowed the perception to go out across the country that he lost. When Muskie got up to speak that evening, he did not give. He did not accept the mantle of victory the way he should have, because they had preconditioned themselves along the lines that they were going to get this unusually high percentage of the vote. And because he got, what did he wind up with, 49.6 or something like that? You know, he won. So much of it is the perception of.
In the final count, George McGovern received 35% of the vote to Ed Muskie's 45%. McGovern, who had built his campaign on doing well in New Hampshire, never lost the momentum and went on to be the Democratic nominee in 1972.
So it's not the candidate that doesn't cry. It's the candidate that's got the strongest organization. I mean, think about that. McGovern's out there meeting everybody 6 times, and Muskie has taken a nap. I mean, that's the lesson in the primary. We listen and we pay attention, and you better not take naps if you want to capture it here. Did you notice I'm sure you all were paying attention to the Iowa caucuses. Do we know who won yet? This morning, as I was getting ready to leave the house, one of the news shows, somebody played. They all gave their victory speeches. They all gave victory speeches. You know, that's the lesson here. Always give a victory speech. Never give a defeat speech. Any questions? All right. You must be doing a good job here, going over everything. There's so many things that I could cover and get distracted on, but I'll just keep plowing along. So in 1976, Jimmy Carter won the primary. 1980, well, let me back up again, because this is a key question that you asked over here. So 1972, here we do it again. We give a slap to the designated frontrunner, Muskie. Muskie was going to be the nominee. Everybody knew since 1968 that Muskie was going to be the next presidential candidate put forward by the Democratic Party. And we slapped him down. So now people really start saying, what is this state all about? What right do they have to be first, you know? Who's this idiot publisher that he's out there, you know? So Florida decided to have a primary in the same day as New Hampshire. You know what we did? Moved the primary to moved town meeting day a week ahead. That's how we stayed first. Then other states started, well, maybe we'll just do, maybe Massachusetts started suggesting, maybe we'll have a New England primary. Let's have a New England primary. We'll all do it together. We can have a little share of some of that glory with New Hampshire. So New Hampshire passed a law. We will have our primary 1 week earlier than any other state in New England.
In New England?
In New England, absolutely. This all happened between 72 and 80, okay? And then some other states started, you know, Delaware, Florida, they're again looking to kind of muscle in on the territory. So New Hampshire amended that law from New England to any other state. And that's how we came to have a law. Actually, it was Jim Splain, a senator from over in the Seacoast, created that made New Hampshire by law to be 1 week earlier than any other state in the Union. Now, something else started happening in 1972, and that was called the caucuses out in Iowa. And the Iowa caucus was actually 6 weeks ahead of the New Hampshire primary in 72 and in 76 and 1980. And 1980, we're just going to look at the Republican primary. And I will ask, who can remember in 1980, what was the quintessential moment that defined just as clearly as crying in front of the Union leader defined 1972, there was another moment that defined 1980 on the Republican side. Anybody? You got it. I paid for this microphone. So let me set it up a little bit. George Bush, well, you had a bunch of candidates on the Republican side. Overall, I think 6 or 7 different candidates. But the two front runners were George Bush and Ronald Reagan. Now, in the Iowa caucuses, George Bush won. But we had 6 weeks. And so the Reagan people had 6 weeks to try to turn it around. Now, they had a pretty good organization in New Hampshire, but they wanted to be real sure. And so this is the story of how we came to have that moment of, I paid for this microphone.
at that point, there were only two candidates in the race. It was George Bush and President Reagan. So that what you really wanted to have, and what I think the National Telegraph saw, and so did I, by the way, and so did I, that the way to clear the air was to have a one-on-one.
Petition was filed with the Federal Elections Commission, and it was found by the FEC that if we were to do that, it would constitute a campaign contribution to those two candidates.
By the National Telegraph.
Yeah. National Telegraph being a corporation, it would be an illegal campaign contribution.
So we called up the Bush people and told them, look, we want the debate. We think it ought to go forward. Why don't we split half of it? Why don't we split it and put it on? We'll each pay half. And the answer back from them was that they didn't want to split it. They didn't want to pay for it.
Because the challenge had come from the Reagan people, and I think it was just a little gamesmanship, I suppose. You know, you pay for it, you challenge us.
So we decided, I happened to be fortunate at the time, I had Angela Buchanan, who was the treasurer for the campaign, who would come into town for the election. The election was going to be now the following Tuesday, I guess. And she was sitting there, and I said, Bay, let's go for it. And she said, and she was all for it, and we wrote the check, and the debate went on.
During the day, I remember talking with John Breen at the Telegraph and saying, John, I want to know whether or not the other candidates are going to be participating or not participating. And he said, the understanding is clear, there are going to be no other candidates, just the president, just Ronald Reagan and George Bush. I said, fine, we're willing to play by any rules that are agreed to, but we want to know what they are, and if that's the way it's going to be, that's the way it's going to be.
But the question of who was going to be in the debate and who wasn't became so fluid over that weekend, I don't think anyone quite knew. In fact, at one point, the decision was trying to be made whether, if the rest couldn't go on, whether Ronald Reagan would go on.
It was perceived as the Bush people just standing back and saying nothing. It wasn't really true. They were willing to concede opening it up to all the other candidates. It was the Telegraph's decision not to open it up.
In the middle of discussions, while we're still trying to negotiate to get everybody on the stadium, on the stage, and we're still trying to negotiate to open it up to all the candidates. But George Bush marches up in through the door and up to the stage and sits there alone. That's my memory, and then there's sort of a pause, and people are wondering, I think, and no one quite knows what's going to happen next. Is Ronald Reagan going to go up on that stage or not? Are the other candidates going to go up on that stage or not?
To have all 7 of them there at once was, I think, not coincidence. When did you know or finally accept the fact that all 7 were going to come out on stage? When they walked past me onto the stage.
The first I knew that they were going to be on the stage was when I saw them coming out on the stage. Someone did ask me if chairs were going to be provided, and I said no. President Reagan wanted to make an opening statement. The statement was not provided for in the format.
To make an announcement would the sound man please turn Mr. Reagan's mic off? Is this on? Mr. Green, would you turn that microphone off? You asked for me if you would... I am paying for this microphone, Mr.
You see, we would have won New Hampshire without this debate. And we would have won it, I think, by a decent margin, but not a big margin. So that George Bush would have still done very well in New Hampshire. The national debate was really national in its impact more than even New Hampshire. It took that Reagan victory in New Hampshire and just gave it tremendous national impact. That's the significance of the debate, much more so than its impact on New Hampshire. It just demolished the Bush campaign.
So when I watched that, you know, it was Jerry Carmen that really knew everything was going on. If you look, the other guys are kind of, well, yeah, I didn't know they were going to go on until they walked by me. But Jerry Carmen and the Reagan people really set that up. They were encouraging other candidates to show up at that thing. You know, the bottom line is they never got on stage. The other candidates, they came up and made their appearance, but really they were just props. They never got to say anything. But here's the other side. The Reagan people, just to be cautious, had actually purchased a whole nother setup. They had tables, chairs, microphones. They could have said, no, the Telegraph, you want to do it with 2, we're going to do it with everybody. The means were there to do it, and the Reagan people didn't push it. It just didn't happen. So, on a little askew a little bit here, there's a movie called State of the Union, starring Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn. Anybody seen it? And in that movie, it's a story about a guy who's running for president, Spencer Tracy, who's a good guy, moral values, and he's going to be a good guy. But as the campaign moves along, he starts to get corrupted by some of the people that are coming in to help him. And the movie is about the tension that he feels between this kind of feeling co-opted, he's losing who he really was. And they're going to have this press conference with live cameras and everything in his house where he's going to come out and make a statement that these bosses want him to make. And at the last minute, I think there's a little interaction with him and Katharine Hepburn, but at any rate, he decides he's going to go out and just kind of bare his soul rather than kind of tout these guys. And when he goes out and he starts to talk, the political guys say, they realize right away that he's not going to say what they want him to say. And so they try to shut it down. And Spencer Tracy says, you can't do that because I'm paying for this microphone. Theory has always been is that Ronald Reagan just speaking the line that he heard back in the 1950s from, but we'll never know. We'll never know. I don't think it was, but it's a fun aside. All right, I don't know how long you expected me to go.
Can I just put in 2 seconds?
Sure. Are you Claire?
Yes.
You know, I've been looking, I know that woman. You were there, were you there?
Yes,
all right.
I was there, yes. There was a lot of confusion, a lot of things going on during that period of time, that weekend. Now, you know, as I recollect it, we had campaign caps on expenditures, and we really debated one of the factors in
whose campaign were you with?
What's that?
Who were you with, Bush or Reagan? Reagan, okay.
Reagan, yes. How do you think I got my job?
I wasn't going down that road, but.
Okay. So we're we had to watch our expenditure caps. I don't know whether those caps are still good today or not, but we only had so much money to spend. And it was really a debate, do we pay for that microphone or do we buy an ad in the Union Leader? Okay, that was the debate. We wanted front page ad because we had heard that Bush bought the top of the Union Leader for Election Day. Now, Election Day in 1980 or 79, it would be, the newspaper really was powerful. And people would see the front page of the Union Leader as they go to the polls.
Yeah.
So Bush bought the top piece, vote Bush, on the Union Leader, which was a very good expenditure on their part. I don't fault them for that. But we wanted one too. But we're deciding, do we do the microphone or do we do the banner in the Union Leader? Well, Mr. Loeb helped. We decided, Jerry went out and got the microphone. And Mr. Loeb asked my husband to do an article saying Reagan's going to win. So Bush had the top banner, and then the headlines in the Union Leader was Reagan to win,
yeah,
says Monier. And that's the front page of the paper. Another significant thing that happened during that campaign, the night of the victory, there were tremendous battles inside the campaign, as there is in a lot of campaigns. And I don't know if you remember John Sears.
Yeah.
Okay, it was a big between.
He was the national director of the Reagan campaign.
Right.
Didn't he resign just before the primary?
No, he was canned.
He was gone just before the primary.
But when do we, it was a major battle, the Sears Group and us, Jerry and I've forgotten who else was in the group. Okay. And it's a major war, basically, of struggle for Reagan's attention. Okay, so when we won, we got rid of Sears, but we had to wait till Reagan won the primary so that getting rid of Sears was buried, rather than that becoming the headline coming out of the New Hampshire primary. And I think that's missed in a lot. We had good strategists on our side.
Well, and Jerry went on to be director of the General Services Administration, just as Bernie Booton did 20 years earlier.
Oh,
So,
yeah, and then he went into an argument. He had some fights with Nancy Reagan, okay? And he wanted to be political director in the White House after he got the GSA job. And then I forgot who went out. Someone else went out, and Jerry was made ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva.
Oh.
So it's much more exciting than what comes out in the papers.
yeah, well, I can't get to everything, but yes. And then, you know, the microphone itself, if you've been to events here in New Hampshire in the last 30 years, you may have seen Malloy Sound and Video, doing the event. Well, Bob Malloy was the sound man. He was the one, and those were his microphones. And the Reagan Library,
Malloy for everything.
yeah,
He was good.
and the Reagan Library wanted to buy the microphones. And Bob won't sell them to them, but he's given them on loan. So the microphones are on loan to the to the Reagan Library out in California, but Bob Malloy still owns them. I think he even has them insured. I don't know, but anyway. So I have one more clip. If you want to hang for it, we can talk about it, or we can just kind of. All right, we'll go for it. So this last clip is 1992. 1992, George Bush is president. And as the primary was approaching, nobody thought he was beatable. So candidates really didn't get in. But when it got to the final test, it came down to really two front runners that were out there, Bill Clinton and Paul Tsongas. Now, the reason I like this clip is because as I started out talking about continuity, okay, this is the same thing. The primary in 92 is just, you just look and they build, starting from Estes Kefauver, still to this day they're building and evolving. But 92 is another, and feel that energy around Clinton. You'll see it with the video.
The first presidential aspirant to step forward was former United States Senator Paul Tsongas of Massachusetts. He announced his candidacy in April 1991. Though Tsongas would be the only announced Democratic candidate for the next 5 months, his campaign struggled to be taken seriously.
He had had cancer. He was a Greek from Massachusetts 4 years after Michael Dukakis was defeated. In light of all that, to be taken seriously, there was no question that we would have to win in New Hampshire at the very least.
But he's been the constant companion of the economic policies of this administration.
It was Governor Bill Clinton who truly began to emerge as the Democrat to beat in the primary. He had a message that people wanted to hear, but there was something more, something only a voter who shakes your hand and looks you in the eye can understand.
What Bill Clinton has is an incredible warmth. And he looks at you, and he focuses on you, and he responds to your question.
You believed that he believed in you. He knew your problems. He knew the frustrations, the anger that you dealt with on a daily basis.
Clinton also campaigned with a fervor and energy that was nonstop. He and wife Hillary would spend over 40 days meeting the voters of New Hampshire, talking and listening.
Brown, Kerry, all of them are out the side door into their cars, gone. Hillary Clinton gets down from the stage, from the head table, and wanders around that room in the Bedford Village Inn until he has talked to every single person that's still there.
But remember, I was talking to a man I had loved for 12 years.
On January 23rd, a former Arkansas State employee accused Bill Clinton of having an affair with her several years earlier. In 1988, a similar charge had taken Gary Hart out of the race. But this was a different year and a different candidate.
Changed her story, that she told the person who offered the money it wasn't true. The person who offered the money said, who cares whether it's true? All you have to do is say it, and he'll be subject to just what you see here today.
The Clintons fought back. They confronted the issue head-on, challenging the credibility of the charge. They appeared together on 60 Minutes to talk about it.
Got up the next morning and a friend of mine called. And they said, you know, if he's a friend, this is when he needs help. And the truth of that statement just struck me to the bone.
Call the guy at the ROTC department at the university, and he'll tell you that I was a troubled young man, probably from his point of view, who opposed the Vietnam War, but I did not do anything wrong.
Just
And
when the
that's the
campaign
fact.
was getting back on track, Clinton found himself again on the defensive. This time it was a letter he had written during the Vietnam War. Clinton's numbers began to fall.
What we want to know is, as the president, how are you going to handle this problem? How are you going to handle this?
With just 10 days to go before the primary, New Hampshire voters were growing weary of news coverage not focused on issues. While the Tsongas campaign continued to gain strength and positive attention, Bill Clinton watched his lead disappear. But rather than give up, Clinton looked to his New Hampshire supporters for advice.
And he had a meeting in a small room at the headquarters with just us. And he said, this isn't going well. He said, we're not doing well. You people know the state much better than I do. What do you think I should do?
And I asked him, I said, do you believe that notwithstanding everything that's come out, that you should be the President of the United States? And he paused. He said, I do. I said, and that's the message. Don't let all this other gibberish come into it.
I just want to do as much person-to-person campaigning as I can.
While the Clinton campaign got itself back on track and shifted into high gear, the Tsongas campaign was forced to shift down. The candidate contracted a case of conjunctivitis.
And the last thing he needed to do was to look very unhealthy. With conjunctivitis, you do. And he was basically off the campaign trail for most of the day, each of those last days of the New Hampshire primary.
At the few campaign stops Tsongas did make, he wore glasses to hide the redness of his eyes. Meanwhile, Bill Clinton was doing everything he could to revive his campaign, still looking for votes late into the night on the eve of the primary.
Hillary was exhausted. She turned to John Broderick and said, I'm exhausted, I'm going to bed. Do something with him.
He wouldn't stop. I mean, late at night, he went to a bowling alley, was campaigning, and stopping at another Dunkin' Donut, and he was just relentless.
On election night, the networks began their coverage of the primary at 9 p.m. The Clinton campaign knew Paul Tsongas was going to win the most votes, but still up for grabs was who would be the story of the night.
You have to go on at 5 past the hour while they're still introducing and take the lead of the night. And the way you do that is declare victory. I said, what do you mean? You get up at 5 past 8 or 9, you introduce Clinton before this mob scene of supporters, and he comes out and says, he won, which leaves your opposition the option of claiming defeat. I mean, there's let them play off of what you've already said.
While the evening is young, and we don't know yet what the final tally will be, I think we know enough to say with some certainty that New Hampshire tonight has made Bill Clinton the comeback kid.
It was Paul Tsongas who won the primary with an 8-point margin over Bill Clinton. But Clinton would be the one who gave the best victory speech. He would use his New Hampshire momentum to go on and win the Democratic nomination for president.
So I love the continuity. You know, Bill Clinton got the same advice from Joe Grant Mason that George McGovern got 20 years earlier. And it works, still works to this day. But did you sense the energy in there that Clinton had? You know, you have to connect here in New Hampshire if you want to succeed. Now, Bill Clinton actually put a black eye on the New Hampshire primary. Anybody want to take a stab at why? Bill Clinton was the first candidate since 1952 to be elected president without winning the New Hampshire primary. We were, until 1992, the perfect, as they said, as Chuck used to say, the perfect bellwether state, until Bill Clinton came along and said, well, you could come in second place and still make it. So, unfortunately, that carried true until the last primary, when Donald Trump turned it around, put us back on track. I'm not sure we're happy about that track, but at any rate. So, again, I could talk for hours about this, but I didn't want to strain you, and some of us have to go home for supper, and I have to go down and give this talk again in Massachusetts in an hour. At any rate, if there's any questions, comments people want to make, have at it. Sure.
When was it that it became strictly a beauty contest? Because I can remember when it was still a beauty contest, but you still also voted for delegates.
Right, right.
When did the voting for delegates go away?
That happened after 1976. In 1976, we had candidates' names and delegates' names on it, and there were over 360 names on the ballot. And that was when Bill Gardner was the Secretary of State at the time and said, wait a minute, this is not cool. And so delegates' names were eliminated from the ballot, and we moved to the system where it was proportional. Yes, Claire?
Yeah, I remember 76, okay, because Reagan ran.
Yep.
And we backed Reagan in 76 because he would be too old and to run in 80. That shows you how smart we were. But in the 76 primary, because there were a lot of delegates, too many pledged to Reagan. So Ford only had the right number of delegates. So Ford won the delegates and we lost, even though we had more votes.
Well, actually, Ford won the primary.
Yeah, Ford won
by 1% or so. Right. Other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. If you're interested, I have a couple of documentaries that I've produced. If you're interested in buying, they're $15 a piece. And don't forget to say nice things about me in your evaluation.
Thank you.
Thank you.